Distinguished colleagues, may I invite you all to take your seat as we go into our session on climate finance and transition to a low-carbon economy. Transforming the supply of green development finance remains at the core of modernizing international financial institutions to enable countries to meet both the SDGs and the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. This session will provide an opportunity to take stock of progress, the need for further action, and emerging lessons from across Africa. It will explore how to ensure that domestic reform helps, not hinders, the green transition, maximizing the opportunity to capture value from mining the critical minerals needed, along with investment in health and human capital. We have a very distinguished panel, and to start us off is the Director for Climate Business Director at the International Finance Corporation, Jamie Ferguson. Jamie is responsible for IFC's climate strategy and policies and delivers on its ambitious targets to make all investments Paris-aligned and 40% of its investment climate positive. Jamie joined the IFC in 2005 and has led and contributed to a range of innovative and new business growth across IFC's investment, advisory, and support operations. His direct transaction experience includes corporate and project debt, equity and mezzanine investment in hydro, wind, solar PV, solar CSP, geothermal, and biomass in Latin America, Africa, South and East Asia, and the Middle East. As Global Director for Strategic Market and Development, Jamie has led a cooperative-wide change process to build IFC's long-term investment pipeline creation practice across all industries and region. He has a BA and MA in zoology from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, and both a master's in environmental economic and policy and an MBA from Yale University. Please help me in welcoming Jamie to the podium.
Thank you, Marlene, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be with you all here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and members of Parliament, I know everyone in this room shares a sense of urgency around the climate crisis. For your constituencies, the climate crisis means skyrocketing food prices, recurring disasters, and a complex and costly transition to inclusive and resilient low-carbon economies. To avoid the worst outcomes, we will not avoid the outcomes, we're experiencing them now, but to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change and to avoid the risk of extreme tipping points, the UNFCCC's global stocktake, to be released at COP28, estimates that the world must reduce carbon emissions by 43% by 2030. I'm going to say that again. The world must reduce carbon emissions by 43% by 2030. That is a complete rewiring of the global economy in just 7 years. For those of you with 7-year-old children or 7-year-old grandchildren, you know 7 years goes very quickly. To coin a phrase, we require change at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, at the speed of the digital revolution. And to avoid going backwards on poverty reduction, investment in adaptation and resilience must grow exponentially. Developing economies need between 2 and 2.8 trillion per year by 2030 to kickstart the new climate economy and protect their populations. According to my friend Fabio at the IMF, private climate financing will need to cover 80 to 90% of those amounts. But let's not forget, climate is the ultimate environmental externality and tragedy of the commons. The markets will not respond and at the scale and pace needed unless carbon is regulated. So it needs close collaboration between governments and private actors and a broad mix of policies to attract the necessary private capital, from carbon pricing to taxonomies and disclosure and carbon trading to blended finance structures. So what are we doing at the World Bank Group to deliver on the ground? The World Bank Group is responding to the climate crisis with ambition and urgency, as you heard from Axel this morning. Over the past 3 years, under our Climate Change Action Plan, which runs 5 years from 21 to 25, we've produced diagnostic reports on 30 of your countries, climate change diagnostics which help countries identify where climate and development opportunities intersect. We've mainstreamed climate action in the way we do business, now assessing every single investment operation for Paris alignment and helping our clients to align their own operations therein. We've scaled our delivery and finance for low carbon and resilient development. Last fiscal year, the World Bank Group delivered a record 38.6 billion in climate finance in developing countries, a 22% increase to the year before, including 12 billion for adaptation and resilience. IFC, who I work for, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, invested 7.6 billion for its own account, or 46% of all its investments, and then mobilized a further 6.8 billion of private capital into those same investments. And MEGA, our political risk insurance and credit enhancement arm, delivered 1.5 billion in climate guarantees. But dollar amounts don't tell you the whole story and obscure the impacts and human stories behind this. So examples include more than half of Delhi Metro now running on solar power, coming from projects tendered by IFC in Madhya Pradesh. The solar park delivered one of the lowest tariffs through a modern and competitive bidding process with financing and support from the bank and IFC. In the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the World Bank Group worked to stop deforestation and improve livelihoods for over 1.2 million people. In Colombia, IFC's Green Building Certification System, EDGE, has paved the way for support by a comprehensive package of technical, financial, and fiscal incentives for developers, financial institutions, and consumers, which together have resulted in 30% of all Colombian new buildings being green certified. That's the equivalent of 12 million square meters of certified green space and more than 163,000 green homes. But we know that's not enough. We are increasing our ambition. We need to do more, and the World Bank Group's Evolution Roadmap, as you heard from Axel this morning, establishes a vision to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet, expanding our mandate to address global challenges alongside fighting poverty across everything we do. The process is underway, focusing on upgrading our vision, on upgrading our operational model and our financial capacity. We've already introduced new initiatives, including a toolkit for crisis preparedness, a private sector investment lab to help us find additional ways to mobilize private capital at scale, and a large effort to complement our current climate finance metrics with impact and outcome metrics to give full insight on what that work does. At IFC, we continue to intensify our efforts to create pipelines of investable opportunities, de-risk those investments, and then mobilize private capital into those investments. We are making a coordinated push to green, hard-to-abate sectors, from zero-carbon steel to battery storage. We are ever expanding and enhancing the greening of the financial sector through setting standards in green, blue, and biodiversity finance. And we are intensifying our involvement in adaptation and resilience. For example, we've now launched a Building Resilience Index, which we hope will do the same thing as our EDGE Green Building Certificate. Let me close with a collective call to action, returning to where I started on the urgency of this matter. Governments must use policy to attract and mobilize the private sector at scale and pace needed to genuinely address climate change. Firstly, we must rapidly wind down distorting incentives, reducing or eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Then we must help new technologies down their cost curves until they achieve scale and competitive pricing, providing financial incentives, grants, or tax breaks to help companies adopt sustainable practice and develop green technologies. And ultimately, we will only internalize the environmental externality into the market behavior with long-term certainty and signaling on a material price on carbon. 25 of these policy approaches are outlined in a new World Bank report entitled Reality Check, with cases from decarbonizing transport in Peru to restoring soil in the Sahel. As representatives of the people, you understand the unique circumstances on the ground in each of your countries, and climate change is affecting each of us in very different ways. You play an essential role in educating the electorate and driving legislation. You also play a crucial role in holding governments accountable for urgent action and delivering on their promises. I look forward to hearing from you, learning your lessons, and hearing how we can all work together to accelerate an inclusive and resilient transition. Thank you very much.
The call to action is clear. It is clear, and it is true that MPs understand the unique circumstances on the ground. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Fabio Nattalucci. Fabio is a Deputy Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department with responsibility for the IMF's global financial markets monitoring and systemic risk assessment functions. He's responsible for the Global Financial Stability Report that gives the IMF's assessment of global financial stability risks an extremely important role. Prior to joining the IMF, Fabio was a Senior Associate Director in the Division of Monetary Affairs at the Federal Reserve Board, where he conducted research and current analysis on the relationship between monetary policy, financial regulatory policy, and financial stability. Between October 2016 and June 2017, Fabio was Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Financial Stability and Regulations at the U.S. Department of Treasury. His responsibilities include leading U.S. engagement on financial regulatory cooperation in the G20, representing the U.S. Treasury at the Financial Stability Board, coordinating between domestic and international post-crisis regulatory reforms, and monitoring developments and vulnerabilities in global financial markets. Fabio has a PowerPoint presentation. Help me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you very much it's a really a privilege and honor to be here. So we published a report on climate finance Monday last week as part of the October flagship. So what I thought I would walk you through some of the main findings of the report, and maybe that could be helpful for a discussion of questions. So I think the starting point, just following up what Jamie was saying, is that there's a huge need of investment in terms of climate finance. The focus of the report is primarily on climate transition as opposed to adaptation, so I will focus on that part, but you need to keep in mind that there's additional needs then for adaptation on whatever numbers I'm putting up now. So according to the International Energy Agency, if we want to reach net zero by 2050, there's a need by 2030 to invest about 5 trillion a year globally. Of that 5 trillion, 40% or 2 trillion has to be in emerging market development economies a year. Now, what we did just to quantify what is the expected role of the private sector, we took the IMF country-specific projection for global gross investment, country by country. And so taking that as a given, taking the IEA estimates as given, then we back of the envelope calculated what is the role that has to be played by the private sector. Essentially, the needs are 2 trillion, We expect and project that this is the public investment, how much will have to be covered by the private sector. That's what you see here on the right. That means in terms of share of the private sector, we need to go from 40%, which is the current number, to about 80 or 90, whether we include China or not, considering the larger role that the government has in China in terms of investment. So whether you take the 80 or 90, those are very, very large numbers. So how do we get to those large numbers? What we're trying to do, we're trying to focus on a number of barriers that are there right now and then come up with policy, particularly on the financial policy side, that may help to reach those targets. In terms of barriers, I think there are, first of all, barriers that are related to emerging markets more broadly, whether we talk about climate or not. Some of them are related to ratings, for example. Only about 60% of emerging markets have an investment grade ratings, and only about 10% of development economies. That means in aggregate, about 50% have an investment grade ratings and 50% have not. That means that you, by not being an investment grade, you're already excluding a number of investors that by mandates can only invest in the investment grade universe. So that's already a barrier that it's right there, even before you go into discussion about climate, whether this is climate or not climate related investment. When you go into climate, then there are a number of other other barriers, right? Some countries have climate policies in place, some countries don't have climate policies in place. When I mean climate policy means can be carbon pricing in place or measure to actual price carbon or climate objectives and DC, so specific climate objectives they want to achieve. Then there are barriers more at the project level. In some cases, there are not enough bankable projects, not how much project to invest in. And in some cases, it's an issue of the range of investor, it's an issue of the risk profile of those investments that is not attractive to the private sector. Just to go one simple point to make about the broader issue of emerging markets and what challenges they face. If you look at the correlation here between essentially the ratings and the E part of the ESG, right? So you perform well on the E score. That means you're essentially ready to doing a good job in terms of environmental objective. If you are a large economy, so high-income countries, that's the first bucket, you see there's a positive correlation. You do well on the E score, you do well on the rating agencies. When you're moving down the income range, particularly for low-income and lower to middle-income countries, that correlation seems to become negative. That means that even for middle and low-income countries, they don't seem to necessarily benefit from improvements on the E-score in terms of translating that into the ratings. And again, considering only 50% of these countries, particularly on the larger one, are investment grade, that means the countries that try their best to invest and improve their performance on the E-score, that doesn't necessarily translate into better ratings. That means that you're not facilitating the flows of private capital into those countries. So that's one important challenge that needs to be addressed, how these ESG and particularly if factors are brought into the ratings methodology that credit ratings are using. And we are having a bunch of discussion with them. Some reaction was not particularly happy in the same sense of this result, but I think that discussion that needs to be held. Another barriers that we look at is like the investment in fossil fuel, right? So as you can see here to the left, investment in fossil fuel continues to remain very high, in particular in the coal industry, and that's true across region. And when you look specifically at oil and gas investment versus the low carbon capital expenditure, so the yellow line here, you can see it's increasing, the yellow bar on top of the red bar, but it's still very, very small compared to the capital expenditure in the oil and gas sector. So if you want to invest, if you want to progress here in terms of reducing carbon emission, clearly the investment in renewable energy needs to pick up significantly, and that's linked to the availability of capital. One other important point is to make is particularly the capital investment in new oil and gas fields. If you look at where we are now or where we need to get by 2030 and 2050, you can see that one important point of emerging markets, that investment continues to go in advanced economy, in emerging markets, and also part of it is done by non-listed companies, right, where there is much less visibility and much more opaqueness in terms of their investment project, in terms of objective of climate and objective in terms of transition. So that's an additional challenge, I think, that it's particularly unique for emerging markets. Another issue to address is what seems to be a lack of alignment between climate policies that financial institutions and commitments they seem to announce and what is an alignment with the actual targets and objectives they achieve. So if you look to the left here, And we look at the 30 largest systemically important banks, and we ask a bunch of questions essentially whether their policy or not in place, right? So you can see that the only bucket where there seems to be some ambitious criteria is the exclusion of project finance for coal mines, plant, and infrastructure, which is the third one. For the other buckets, so whether they are net zero aligned in terms of oil and gas policies, whether they are phasing out coal, you can see that the largest share here is that they either don't have policies in place or they are relatively weak policies in place. And that translates into numbers. If you look at syndicated loan origination in the fossil fuel by the third companies, that's the blue line, you can see there was some decline post-Paris Agreement in 2015, but essentially then numbers have flatlined. And if anything, post-COVID, the origination of the syndicated loan market in the oil and in fossil fuel actually has picked up. By contrast, if you look at what we call the most ambitious financial institution and how much they invest in sustainable loans, you really almost need a microscope to solve those like yellow and green line. They're just very, very small number. Other sector or the private sector segment that might be playing an important role and they need to step up is the investment fund sector. Now, if you look at sustainable investment fund, they clearly have picked up, right? So the chart to the left shows you essentially post-2019, there's been an increase in asset under management by the ESG funds. But if you want to really look at those that actually aim to have an impact, so the objective is to have a climate impact, so the dark green one, it's still a very small fraction of the ESG universe. Now, not only that, but if you actually look into E, what you try to achieve with E and whether that E translates into actual climate impact. And so what we did here, we look at the 5% worst firm in terms of E vis-a-vis impact. And you see there's a negative correlation. So ideally, you would want to find a positive correlation, right? So if you take the 5% worst performing firm in terms of E, ideally, you want to take out the 5% worst performance in terms of impact. But that correlation is not there. That means that if you just operate as an investment fund using E as your guiding guiding principle, if you want, you're not necessarily going to achieve impact in terms of climate. So there's really a need to reconsider how these labels are constructed, what this means in terms of transparency, because that's huge implication, I think, for market function and market integrity. And then let me close maybe with policies. Well, how do we get there? How do we remove these barriers? I think the first point, the starting point is to be the one on top. So we need, in some sense, some prerequisite policies that are necessary, whether this is climate or not, for emerging markets, right? So I mentioned ratings, but also you need to have in place carbon pricing, so measure to actually assess the pricing of carbon, but also measure that what we call the climate information architecture. You need data, you need high quality, comparable, consistent data, otherwise you cannot measure climate risk and climate opportunities, and you cannot compare across countries. Then you need taxonomies in place, particularly transition taxonomy for emerging markets. The world is not green or not green in emerging markets. There's a lot of greenish in the middle. You need taxonomies that actually incentivize over time to move toward green. And then you need disclosure. And therefore, the emerging markets, I think there's a need of discussion how quickly they need to go into the global disclosure and what are emerging market specific issues that need to be considered in terms of disclosure. And then there's a number of measures that are more climate specific, right? So we need, for example, innovative financial instrument for phasing out coals. There's really a desperate need for more sharing of risk as you try to move away from coal. Just to give a number, the average age of coal production in advanced economies, take the United States, is 40 years. That means that it's much easier to phase out of coal because you already essentially amortize the cost. If you go to emerging markets, the average age of those coal production is 13 years. That means that either you need to wait much longer to amortize the cost, or just phasing out of those, it's way more expensive to do in emerging markets than advanced economies. We need labels for sustainable fund. Again, the mapping between climate impact and E is not there. We need to think about how to incorporate ESG score into the credit ratings. Some of these ESG factors have a long-term impact. So I think there's a need to consider whether those are really incorporated into the much shorter horizon that often rating agencies takes. We need blended finance instruments, so private-public risk sharing. And then, obviously, there's a role for this both for the MDBs, James, and then the fund can also play a significant role. In terms of the RST, this new instrument that we have in place, but more broadly in terms of reforms that need to be put in place, in terms of technical assistance capacity, and also the convening role of the fund, in terms of bringing everyone together and thinking about how to do risk sharing and what are the country-specific circumstances that need to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabio. Interesting technical information. We now move to our MP panelists, and we have two. Our first is Lord Faka Fanua. I hope I got that right. Lord Faka Fanua embarked early on his political career at the very young age of 24. Then he became one of the youngest ever members of parliament in Tongan history. Lord Faka Fanua first assumed the role of Speaker of Parliament at the age of 27, currently serving his third term as Speaker of Parliament. He is still the youngest presiding officer in the world. Having served on the executive of various international fora, Lord Faka Fanua was recently elected by the Asian Pacific Regional Bloc of the IPU to be a member of the board of the Forum of Young Parliamentarians. Help me welcome our colleague, Lord Faka Fanua.
First, I want to acknowledge Morocco is the host of the World Bank and IMF meetings this week, and also stand in solidarity with the King and the people of Morocco in the wake of the devastating earthquakes 1 month ago. And would also like to acknowledge the recent disaster this weekend in Afghanistan and the over 2,000 people who have lost their lives. I'd like to acknowledge the chair of the Parliamentary Network and World Bank and IMF, Right Honourable Liam Byrne, who invited me to speak here from the Kingdom of Tonga, which is actually not in Africa, but in the Pacific Ocean. But I'll do my best to relate. I want to acknowledge my fellow speaker, Sahar Albazar, who also sat on the board of the Forum of Young Parliamentarians of the IPU as the former president. And it's an honor to join the fellow distinguished speakers on the panel this morning. Just want to cover three distinct areas, basically take stock from the perspective of an island nation, the Kingdom of Tonga, which is also belongs to the Small Island Developing States group of the United Nations. Tonga is the third most vulnerable country to natural disasters and external shocks. This is according to the World Risk Index report of 2021. In fact, 7 of the top 10 most vulnerable SIDS countries all belong in the Pacific Islands. In 2021, we shut down, like most countries, for 2 years because of the COVID pandemic. However, early last year, we suffered a volcanic eruption and a tsunami that devastated our country. This was on top of a COVID-19 outbreak. It impacted our country by a reduction of 18.5% of our GDP, compounding our climate change challenges. Tonga, like many other small island developing states, suffer from a narrow economic base, distance from markets, and a lack of natural resources, and we're very vulnerable to external shocks, such as those caused by the climate change-induced natural disasters. So constantly catching up due to the large infrastructure deficit is something that we're used to in the Pacific Islands and many low-income countries. Inflation in August last year hit 13.8%. This was composed of mostly 10% from fossil fuels. This is because of OPEC restrictions to oil production and also the war between Russia and Ukraine. This has impacted us dramatically because of the high inflation rates, increasing the cost of living for our people, and restricting our ability to adapt and mitigate to climate change. In 2010, Tonga had an ambitious plan under what we call the Tonga Energy Roadmap to achieve 50% renewable energy by 2020. 10 years to achieve 50% renewable energy. Come 2020, we had only achieved 18% renewable energy penetration. However, it didn't stop our country. The government implemented Term Plus, or Tonga Energy Roadmap Plus, to reach a target of 70% by 2025. As of this year, we have still only achieved 18%. It didn't stop us. In COP27, November last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, Tonga was the first country in the United Nations to sign on to the Blue Planet Alliance commitment to reach 100% renewable energy by 2045. We don't lack ambition. However, we lack the means and the finance to achieve these targets. Yet our contribution to global carbon emissions is less than 0.0001%. But that hasn't stopped us from having the ambition. I'd like to briefly touch on the domestic reforms and the policies that we've implemented domestically to transition into green, and the implementation in Tonga. In 2021, we passed an energy bill in Parliament that consolidated regulation of our energy under one energy commission. This bill also mandated the government to make the targets under our nationally determined contributions, our NDCs under the Paris Agreement, to be binding on our consecutively elected governments. In Parliament, closer to home, we have a more active standing committee on environment and climate change, holding the government accountable to our NDCs and holding our government accountable to keep them in track. We also, under our Parliament Committee for Environment and Climate Change, sensitize our constituents and our members of Parliament to the NDCs and the science of climate change. We also have an annual Development Constituency Fund. This is a grant to our members of Parliament that works directly to each constituency, which is often used for climate change adaptation, like building seawalls and wharves. There is also an allocation since COVID-19 for measures of public health, which after the wake of COVID-19 pandemic now, we'll be looking at reallocating for climate change adaptation. And finally, the last point I want to touch on is green finance in the perspective of our country. A back-of-the-envelope estimate of hard and soft infrastructure needs for adaptation and mitigation of climate change estimates around $1.5 billion over the next 5 years for Tonga. However, the finance available for this adaptation work is only $500 million over the next 5 years. This leaves a $1 billion gap. A recent report by the ANZ Group, released last month, states that in the Pacific, there is a $12 billion infrastructure deficit through to 2030. The impact on the Pacific Islands' ability to adapt and mitigate for climate change and also achieve the SDG Development Agenda for 2030 is highly compromised because of this deficit. Regarding the Green Climate Fund and the direct accreditation, it's very slow and lengthy. I don't need to explain more, just that Tonga is assisted by the United Nations Development Programme and the Asia Development Bank to access this funding. And to date, we have only mobilized $50 million US for solar and battery energy storage systems on our islands. In conclusion, key challenges: direct funding to Green Climate Fund is cumbersome, and urgent projects can take up to 3 years to access if you can. We are at the forefront of the external shocks. We lack the comprehensive risk assessment technical abilities. We have inadequate fund access and require resilient infrastructure yesterday. Tight fiscal space and relative high debt to GDP ratio limits our ability to react. We have limited local capacity and skill shortage for development agenda, and the global climate finance flows are nowhere near the estimated needs. In terms of potential solutions from our vantage point, I'm not an expert in finance, but I'm just a politician who's seen the broader picture. We need government guarantees, concessional or sovereign. Sometimes it's not even good enough. More private sector involvement, as my fellow speakers have mentioned, need to be collaborated with government public infrastructure. We need to mitigate the risks of scale and high costs. We need innovative funding structures, including blended financing. Innovating concessional support for commercial insurance. We need to broaden the scope of sovereign parametric insurance schemes in the high-risk areas, such as the small island developing states. We need something like what Biden has in America, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, for Africa, for the Pacific, for the developing countries. This is a call for developed nations and the large donor partners. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. IMF reports recently state are at $7 trillion. That is few factors, probably 3 times of our global budget for education. And so on that point, I would like to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an informative presentation. And it caused me to wonder how many of us here as parliamentarians know what is required for green financing in our country. Our next MP speaker is the Deputy Chair of the Committee of Foreign Relations for Egypt, the Honorable Shahar Al-Bazar. She has been a Member of Parliament since 2020 and has also been the President of the IPU Forum of Young Parliamentarians since 2021. She has extensive experience in development and civil society in Egypt, Somalia, and Kenya, addressing women's empowerment, education, and youth employment, as well as health care. She has concrete experience in proposing and communicating policy recommendations to diverse audiences, ranging from clients to key stakeholders and high-level government officials. Please help me in welcoming our colleague Zahara Al-Bazar to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, distinguished panelists, I want to start by thanking Morocco for hosting the annual meeting and pay my sincere condolences for the affected victims of earthquake. Now, I believe when we speak about climate financing, we need to speak also and address the heavy foreign debt burden on our nations. This heavy debt hinders our nations from tackling the threats of climate change adequately. Let me illustrate by numbers. According to the Global Center of Adaptation study, Africa alone needs $50 billion a year for climate adaptation. Yet, shockingly, this year only, more than $60 billion we will have to spend it in debt service. Not loans, not interest of loans, but debt service. Comparing the numbers, that shows a clear misalignment of priorities. Therefore, young parliamentarians from Egypt, Ghana, Senegal, and Indonesia came together and launched an initiative for climate financing. We called it Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a South African phrase that means I am because you are. We wanted to signify the importance of working together as humans in facing the climate change risks. The initiative has been joined by 50 countries from Global South and Ukraine as a lower middle income country. We are addressing the IMF and the World Bank with 3 key requirements. The first one, we ask for more debt swaps for climate adaptation, which will have a dual impact and benefit. First, it will be providing debt relief tool. The second is a climate action. Second thing is we ask for IMF surcharges policy to be immediately suspended and eventually eliminate by the upcoming review. These additional charges on top of the basic interest rate fees have placed an unfair burden on vulnerable countries that need financial support. Finally, we ask to have a common framework for debt relief to the lower middle income countries, similar to the G20 framework for the lower income countries. This framework will help these nations deal with fiscal tightness and liquidity problems. In conclusion, we need to ask the hard questions. How many lives do we need to lose before we work together? How many cities need to be wiped off the earth before we work together? Let's remember the essence of Ubuntu. Let's work together in facing the devastating impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Provocative presentation. Provocative presentation. The floor is now open to questions. I will take groups of 2 or 3 at a time. I see a hand. Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Senegal. Okay. Please go ahead.
Bonjour, merci Madame la Vice-présidente. Je suis l'honorable Koulibaly Madiara, député de la Nation de Côte d'Ivoire et membre du réseau parlementaire, du conseil d'administration du réseau des parlementaires. Le continent africain ne contribue qu'à hauteur de 4% au total des émissions mondiales de gaz à effet de serre, soit le pourcentage le plus faible de toutes les régions. Et pourtant, son développement socio-économique est menacé par la crise climatique. Selon le programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, les coûts annuels d'adaptation dans les pays en développement, actuellement estimés à 70 milliards de dollars, passeront à 300 milliards de dollars d'ici 2030 et à 500 milliards de dollars d'ici 2050. Fort de cela, qu'est-ce qui est fait par les pays développés pour combler leur déficit de financement climatique d'avant 2020, qui s'élève à 100 milliards de dollars? Par ailleurs, la transition vers une économie à faible émission de carbone n'est-elle pas un frein à l'industrialisation de l'Afrique et son développement, car nous disposons à profusion de gisements de charbon, de pétrole, de gaz que les pays développés ont utilisés pour s'industrialiser. Je vous remercie.
All right, thank you so much. May I just ask you to keep the questions precise. Nigeria.
Thank you very much for the panel. I just want to ask the last speaker, can we start to think about exchanging debts for the pains of climate change? For example, who pay for emission? Who pay for the destruction of climate issues in Africa? Don't you think that the world is owing Africa a lot of money, you know, in terms of emission and all issues coming from climate change? Can we quantify the amount that the geocentric world is owing Africa, and we can decide to, you know, do a balance sheet and exchange our debts for the malaise of climate change and the nuisance that come with it. Because, the climate change doesn't need a visa to travel from one country to another. A climate disaster, erosion, doesn't require a visa to move from one country to another. And this is called disaster to us. Car manufacturing, for example, have called deregulation and distortion in our climate. So my question is simple. Can't we quantify all of this, and get the figure, and then begin to talk to China, talk to United States, and the big ones that are right here, because they will never sign any agreement related to climate change. They will support, but they will not sign an agreement that is committed.
Thank you.
So can we exchange debts for the pains of climate change? Thank you.
Question is noted. Senegal.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole. Je salue aussi l'opportunité de ce forum. Mais tout d'abord, comme tout un chacun, nos prières pour les disparus du séisme qui s'est passé il y a un mois ici au Maroc. Moi, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, mon intervention va vers la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur le changement climatique. Depuis 1994 déjà, il y a un temps qui s'est écoulé. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, il n'est pas temps de revenir sur les objectifs des accords de Paris? Donc, il faudrait qu'on puisse au moins essayer de voir ce qui a été défini par rapport aux contributions déterminées nationales de chaque pays pour trouver les fonds essentiels pour pouvoir accompagner les politiques sur le changement climatique. Parce qu'on parle aujourd'hui du comité mondial sur l'adaptation et je salue aujourd'hui la participation de mon président, qui est le président Macky Sall, aujourd'hui dans le conseil de surveillance. Et je crois qu'il faudrait qu'on puisse travailler dans l'adaptation. Ne pas seulement s'arrêter, bien sûr, aux réformes des textes, accompagner les budgets, mais il faut aller plus loin par rapport à l'atténuation, aller vers les populations, parce qu'aussi, si on parle d'adaptation, il faudrait qu'on puisse accompagner les processus d'une compréhension de main de l'homme, parce qu'on sait que quand on parle de changement climatique, il y a bien sûr la nature, les sinistres et les catastrophes, mais il y a aussi la main de l'homme qui participe à ça. Il faudrait que les populations puissent s'approprier ces politiques. Et je crois aujourd'hui, c'est essentiel que tout un chacun, ensemble, puisse revenir sur ces aspects. Je termine par rapport au fonds, quelqu'un l'a souligné tout de suite, la mise à disposition de ces fonds qui puissent accompagner la mise en œuvre des réformes qu'on a mises en place pour le changement climatique. Et vous avez suivi la 78e session de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies et je crois qu'il y a beaucoup de conclusions. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for the questions. Time to come back to the objectives of the Paris Agreement and find funds for climate change. What say you, Jamie?
Thank you. Thumbs up. Good. Thank you, Marlene, and thank you, honourable colleagues. Some important comments in there at the very heart of climate response in terms of shared but differentiated responsibilities and impacts, right? And it's vital to understand those differentiated responsibilities. In terms of accessing funds, it is complicated. We find complexity in accessing them as well. IFC is an implementing agent of the various sources of funds, and as a private sector, our job is to catalyze the private sector. So we're trying to help mobilize commercial capital on a risk-return basis into climate finance, and particularly in some of the newer technologies which are more expensive, less affordable in emerging markets. It's important to lower the risk and make them more affordable, to blend concessional money with commercial money, and that's where we access and look to access those different sources of concessionary climate money. And when we do, it's been really impactful, hugely impactful. We've achieved a 10-to-1 mobilization rate. When we access $1 of concessional capital, we're managing to mobilize 10 more of commercial capital into those climate projects. But there isn't enough, and it is too complicated to access at the moment. So I share the sentiment.
Thank you. Fabio, you spoke about the importance of quality data, high quality data. The question about the contribution from the African continent to emission and the burden that is placed on the continent. How does the data impact the decisions being taken, and how should the data properly impact the decision?
I think I want to make a couple of points and then get to that as helpful points. So the external environment has changed, right, compared to 2 years ago. Before central banks started tightening monetary policy, going back to pre-COVID, cost of capital was much cheaper. US interest rates were lower, so financing any project anywhere was way cheaper. Right now, US Treasury are up almost 5%. Spreads for sub-investment grade in the US are about 500 basis points. That means that private capital can make almost 10% just investing in the US. That has completely scaled up the cost of capital for emerging markets. So it's a way tougher external environment to do that. Now, for some technology, things have got cheaper. So if you take, I don't know, solar, for example, obviously the technologies, the solar panel are way cheaper than they are. But that's just the cost of technology itself. That doesn't include then the cost of raising capital in emerging markets. So we've done some work looking into this, that there are number ranges, estimates out there, but imagine that the same kind of project in emerging markets on solar panel can be as high as 2 times more expensive than it is in advanced economies. So it's more expensive to raise capital, and it's more expensive to move the same technology applied to emerging markets. Now, those are challenges. There are also opportunities for private capital. One of the issues that it's often raised is the issue of data. That if you want to invest capital, even for impact capital, those that have, in addition to financial returns, have other objectives, right? Having climate impact. But they don't, as often there are no data. There are low quality data, they are not available in some cases. They're also not comparable across countries, so it's difficult to make an investment decision without knowing what the return on capital is going to be in different countries. So I think there's clearly a need for better data, quality, comparable, consistent across jurisdiction. There are extra challenges, obviously, for emerging markets, so I think we need to adapt and tailor these policy approaches to country-specific circumstances. And there's also need for more data related to adaptation. Adaptation is a very more challenging approach from a private sector perspective. Some projects, they don't have a clear stream of revenues that actually can be used to back return for private capital. So there, in that segment, the adaptation, there's clearly more need for public sector needs to play a larger role in terms of implications. And then finally, I think it was mentioned about measuring the impact of carbon. I think there is a need for carbon pricing. That is the only way to price carbon. There is a growing number of emerging markets that are adopting some different forms of carbon pricing, whether this is straight taxation, whether this is exchange traded voluntary carbon markets. There's a number of issues that need to be resolved, but without pricing carbon, that is the only way to price risk, but also opportunities.
Thank you. Our MP speakers, if you want to weigh in, and also specifically to you, Sahar, in relation to quantifying the climate change, exchanging the debt at the pace of climate change.
Sure. Can you hear me? Well, thank you for the question. It's very important to quantify the impacts of climate change, and I believe that one of the important outcomes of COP27 in Egypt was the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund. At least we have a start of it, and I hope that in COP28 we will come out with a more strong and solid frame for the Loss and Damage Fund. And again, I want to stress on debt swaps and the suspension of the surcharges or the debt service of the debts is a quicker solution because this is a money in hand. But as you see, when we have the idea of the Loss and Damage Fund, and then we are going to negotiate it again in COP28, and we do not guarantee we will finalize the negotiations in COP28. It might move to COP29, and again, it moves from COP to COP. So we need to move fast, like the impacts of climate change are being fast, more than we realize. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Lord Bakafawa, did you want to?
Yes. I hear there's frustration, and like the Pacific Islands, there's frustration in Africa. And I think that evidently we have the resources, the capital is there. And I think the issue of accessing it is systemic, whether it's private or public. One place that I think we can easily access, or low-hanging fruit, is in the fossil fuel subsidies. The $7 trillion that we're currently subsidizing fossil fuel, we're basically subsidizing these climate change-induced disasters, which is insane. I think that if we allocate the subsidies into adaptation and mitigation, that $7 trillion would easily fund the 300 billion that the Honourable Speaker from Cote d'Ivoire mentioned that you need in Africa. So fossil fuel subsidies might be a low-hanging fruit for politicians to push in the developed countries.
Thank you. Next round of questions. May I see the back? Morocco, Kenya, Mauritania. Yes. Morocco. Please introduce yourself as you ask the question.
شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وصحبه أجمعين. محمد الزين، نائب رئيس مجلس النواب. طبعا لابد من كلمة الشكر في حق كل من نظم وساهم من قريب أو بعيد في جعل هذا اللقاء في مستوى الحدث الذي نعيشه اللحظة. طبعا حضرت العديد من اللقاءات والمناظرات والمرافعات، طبعا نفس الإرادة، لكن الواقع لا يتغير. سمعت الكثير عن الدور البرلماني وإسهامه في قضايا ربما مجتمعية تهم أساسا الجانب البيئي الذي أصبح اليوم يسائلنا أكثر من أي وقت مضى. اليوم نعيش انهيار مناخي، وهو سبب الكوارث الطبيعية التي نتعرض لها اليوم: زلازل، فيضانات، جفاف، ندرة الماء، وربما الأوبئة، وظهور ظواهر غريبة كالبق أو حشرة البق التي جعلت من فرنسا مهدا لانطلاق فتوحات لها قادمة لا قدر الله. في ظل هذه التحولات المناخية وهذا الانهيار المناخي يطفو على السطح دور البرلمانات ودور التشريع أو التشريعات لمواجهة هذه الظواهر. النقاش الحقيقي والذي سيكون محددا ل30 سنة القادمة، يعني وأنا جد متفائل، ليس هو الحديث عن تعافي الاقتصادات بعد الكوفيد أو معدلات التضخم التي يعرفها العالم، أو حتى الأزمات وتبعاتها على الاقتصادات العالمية. النقاش الحقيقي هو: هل هناك إرادة سياسية وأكاد أقول إنسانية لإنقاذ ما يمكن إنقاذه؟ لا تخطئوا، البرلمانات عاجزة كل العجز للعب أدوارها الدستورية والقانونية والتشريعية في العالم. وهناك قوى أقوى من البرلمانات، إنها قوى الإنتاجية وقوى المال والأعمال. إنه جشع الإنسان الذي سينتهي بابتلاعه ووضع حد لطموحه وأحلامه. سؤالي اليوم حول الإنسان بغض النظر عن القبعات والمسؤوليات والمواقع والحكومات والبرلمانات والمؤسسات. سؤالي اليوم هو حول أبنائنا، جيل الغد، ومسؤولياتنا التاريخية اليوم حيال هذا الجيل. يجب أن نقر بالفشل، يجب أن نقر بالفشل، وهو فشل لا يمكن أن تخفي تجاعيده مساحيق المؤتمرات والمناظرات والمرافعات. ما يميز خطاباتنا هو إعلان نوايا يلزمنا، يجب علينا، إننا مطالبون. مجرد إعلان نوايا وخواطر، والوقت يمر بسرعة نحو التلف ونحو الدمار. لا أريد أن أكون متشائما، فقط أستحضر الواقع الحقيقي الذي يداهمنا بعيدا كما قلت عن مساحيق التجميل. أستفز فكركم اللحظة للحديث عن التدابير الفعلية لإقرار إرادة لإقرار إرادة سياسية حقيقية تفوق التشريع، إرادة تصبح ثقافة. أقول ثقافة يتقاسمها الجميع من المواطن إلى أعلى سلطة في القرار. شكرا.
Thank you so much. May I just ask everyone to keep the questions as short as possible to enable as many members of the delegation to ask questions.
Let me try. My question goes to the gentleman from the IMF. The figures that have been bandied around for climate financing for the least developed countries is about $2 to $3 trillion every year. And the report that he has just quoted, the reality check report, says that 90% of that for most of the least developing countries will come from the private sector. About 10% will be from the multilateral development banks or concessional loans. Given the fact that almost all those countries are rated either negatively or below par, how then are these countries going to access those $2 to $3 trillion in order to finance the green economy? Is it that we are only giving out figures and projections and hopeful things, knowing very well that these countries will not have access to these credits, and therefore they will keep on suffering from the vagaries of climate change, while they are the victims and not the emitters? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mauritania.
Bonjour, messieurs, mesdames. Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bien évidemment, je commence par présenter mes condoléances et toute ma compassion à mon deuxième pays, le Maroc, pour ce terrible tremblement de terre qui a suivi. Et je prie Dieu pour accueillir en son paradis les âmes des victimes et souhaite un bon rétablissement à tous ceux qui sont encore malades. Alors, je viens d'un pays, la Mauritanie. Je m'appelle Zain Abidine, je suis député à l'Assemblée nationale de la Mauritanie. Donc, je viens d'un pays où plus des 2/3 du territoire sont désertiques. Et vous convenez avec moi que le réchauffement climatique n'est pas un cadeau pour la désertification. Donc, ça va continuer. Et ça va continuer encore davantage si des dispositions ne sont pas prises, si des financements ne sont pas donnés, et beaucoup de financements pour lutter contre la désertification, qui est un phénomène d'abord transversal, parce que ça concerne beaucoup de pays, mais qui est un phénomène aussi implacable qui va très vite. Donc je n'ai pas tellement entendu parler de cela. C'est une très grande préoccupation dans notre pays. Bien évidemment, je souscris au transfert de capitaux en faveur des pays qui subissent passivement le réchauffement climatique. C'est devenu quelque chose dont tout le monde en parle, et c'est certainement quelque chose auquel tout le monde souscrit, probablement à des degrés divers en fonction des préoccupations des uns et des autres. Mais je pense que c'est une dynamique qu'il faut absolument renforcer et vers laquelle tout le monde doit tendre pour plus de justice dans le monde et surtout pour plus de stabilité. Parce que nous avons eu quand même des leçons extrêmement importantes notamment le Covid-19, qui est un petit virus qui a bouleversé tout le monde et qui nous a probablement même conduit à réfléchir à changer de paradigme. Évidemment que les choses se rétablissent un peu, mais cela peut arriver à tout moment. Ça peut arriver sous d'autres formes. Donc je pense que pour une fois, il faut réfléchir à changer de paradigme, il faut réfléchir à poser des problèmes, il faut réfléchir à plus de justice et plus d'équité dans le monde. Dans mon pays, une réflexion très intéressante est en train d'avancer, et là je lance un appel à... C'est probablement le point essentiel. Mais notre pays a un projet mondial très important de production d'hydrogène vert. L'hydrogène vert, c'est quelque chose qui s'est fait avec le soleil et le vent. Donc, et ce sont deux choses qui sont tellement disponibles dans nos pays désertiques. Je lance un appel à nos partenaires pour que cela fasse partie de leurs préoccupations parce que c'est quelque chose de très, très important. Évidemment, c'est tout à fait nouveau.
Thank you.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you, Martin. Before I throw over to the panelists, I know parliamentarians are an unruly bunch, difficult to handle, like to talk a lot, and you often put the speaker in a very difficult position. I really am trying to cooperate. May I ask, if you have a comment to precede the question, that you keep the comment succinct. And please pose a direct question.
What did he ask?
So this round is focused on the financing, the responsibility to the next
so the famous one I
generation,
heard.
and the call for a paradigm shift. I see the Moroccan delegation with a hand raised. May you just lift your tent so I can see? I see the hands in the back. So if you promise to be very brief, then I'll add your questions before I throw to the panelists. Nigeria, if you are not brief, then you will incur the wrath of the moderator. Please go ahead.
Mike. Three of them died.
All right. I see
Microphone.
Côte d'Ivoire. We'll come back to you while we're waiting. Côte d'Ivoire, very brief, and then we come back to Nigeria. If the microphone is there.
Merci, madame. Je remercie les panélistes. Je vais être bref. Merci de reconnaître le rôle crucial du député, donc des parlementaires dans le développement, qui va de pair avec le développement du capital humain. C'est juste une plaidoirie parce que le changement climatique est un frein principal au développement de nos pays. En tant que député parlementaire, je souhaite attirer votre attention sur son impact sur la sécurité alimentaire de nos communautés et par ricochet sur la nutrition. La Banque mondiale est un partenaire crucial pour la nutrition de nos pays, la Côte d'Ivoire notamment à travers l'IDA. Je souhaite encourager cette dynamique et mettre en avant qu'il est essentiel que les financements pour soutenir nos pays à lutter contre le changement climatique s'assurent de soutenir les activités agricoles communautaires destinées à renforcer l'autosuffisance alimentaire et le développement économique des personnes les plus vulnérables. De plus, il est essentiel que les députés de la société civile soient au premier rang du suivi de l'utilisation de ces fonds pour en garantir l'efficience. Merci.
Very well. Nigeria, do you now have the mic? Okay. In the meantime, access to financing, the $1 million question.
Sure, Marlene. So thank you, merci, asante sana. A couple of reactions here. One is, from the start of climate conversations and international debate, there's been an acceptance of shared but differentiated responsibility. I don't think we speak enough about the counterpoint of that, which is shared but differentiated solution. And my colleague Fabio has spoken to it. Mitigation, there is a lot of opportunity for private capital to contribute if the regulations are correct. And again, I will say that more times than you'd imagine, but it's so important. Private capital will flow if the enabling environment is correct, if the sector setup is correct, and if we price carbon correctly, it will respond. Adaptation is a lot harder, and as mentioned, a lot of adaptation investment is non-revenue generating public good, and so is likely to be a greater focus for public investment. What does all that mean? When it comes to the particular algorithm or the particular scenario of each of your countries? It means that if the reality is that your country is not contributing significant emissions, but is going to be facing terrible adaptation issues, we need more public money and we need more concessional public money. If your country is a significant contributor on emissions, then we need to get the rules right to get private capital flowing to do those. And I think it's easy to get confused between them, and it's important to have clarity on those things. Likewise, I share the dismay of some of the colleagues on this, right? Too much talk, not enough action. We are nowhere, let's be clear. We are nowhere. Yeah. The scale of the action that is necessary is unprecedented, and it will only happen with a price on carbon. I wish that was not a political issue. What should and will always be a political issue is once you price carbon, the revenues generated by that carbon is a deeply political issue, because the redistribution of those revenues that is what politics is. And if we're going to have a just transition, because even easy transitions leave some people behind, this transition is not going to be easy, whether it's at the between countries or within countries. So that redistribution conversation is a complex political one we should be involved in. We shouldn't be stuck at the one which is pricing the carbon in the first place to move the markets. On the point for our colleagues in Côte d'Ivoire, completely agree. Food security is vital here, and will become more sensitive with climate change, and it's a focus of a large-scale program with my colleagues on the public side of the bank, and also for us on the private side of the bank. An increasing proportion of our climate finance. If we went back 10 years ago, IFC's climate finance in the private sector would be basically renewable energy. Today, our climate finance is massively diversified across all sectors, whether it's green buildings, whether it's climate-smart agriculture, whether it's in transport. So all sectors we are engaging on the climate perspective, and climate-smart agriculture is an important piece of it. Often through financial intermediaries to try to get to smallholder farmers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Molly.
Nigeria. The mic seems to be escaping the Nigerian delegation for now. You will have your say. Take.
يونس بنان رئيس معهد الدراسات الاجتماعية والإعلامية بالمغرب، وهو مجمع تفكير مغربي. سؤالي سيكون جد مختصر بخصوص عندما نتكلم عن التغييرات المناخية نتكلم عن أضرار اقتصادية واجتماعية تمس العديد من الدول، لكن لا ننسى أن هذه التغييرات المناخية تشكل فرصة لبعض الاقتصادات في الترقي وفي النمو. وقد نتكلم عن التغييرات المناخية التي حدثت في القطب الشمالي وأدت إلى وجود مثلا الممر البحري الشمالي الذي أصبح وفي المستقبل سيكون ممر للتجارة العالمية. كما لا ننسى أيضا بعض المناطق التي أصبحت مناطق خضراء وأصبح بالإمكان فلاحتها. وهذه المناطق التي نتكلم عنها توجد في ملك دول الآن تفكر في صندوق تنمية جديد، ونتكلم عن كونتونيو ريزيرف ارانجمنت الذي قد قام بتشكيله البريكس. ما هي الخطوات التي سيتخذها البنك الدولي وصندوق النقد الدولي أمام هذا التقاطب الذي ربما سيشكل عقبة أمام سياسات صندوق النقد الدولي المناخية؟ وشكرا.
Question noted. Nigeria.
I have the mic here. Can I just ask my comment?
Please go very quickly.
They're very concise. I'm from the private sector. I want to just give you a view of where 90% of the money is coming from and where it will come from if there's data. If the World Bank, or the IFC actually, and EIB will make public the GEMS database, which is about performance of countries and companies in countries where the multilateral development banks, 24 of them, make loans. If that data, which they've been hiding for 15 years, is 33-year data, it is hidden, and it will be made public only a little bit has been made public. If that were made public, the private sector could assess the risks, and if they can assess the risks, including ratings, non-investment grade or investment grade, the money would flow. My suggestion is the IFC and the EIB release that data as soon as possible so the private sector can look at it, rating agencies can look at it, and the funds flow. That's the answer.
Thank you. Nigeria? Then I'll take one more question after Nigeria from the Guinea delegation.
Thank you.
I will throw it to the
My
panel.
name is Darlington Nwokocha. I bring greetings from the Nigerian Senate. My question is this. Is there any compensation that can be considered enough for any man-made disaster? Because what can we do to eliminate the man-made disaster cost by the developed economies in their bid to harvest the natural resources in underdeveloped countries like Africa, which they deliberately carry out with the sole aim of compensating when aftermath of the disaster has been caused? Thank you.
Very succinct, Nigeria. Thank you. Guinea? While we're waiting for the question, I'll also ask the panelists if you have a closing thought in addition to answering the question. You can do both as we close out the panel.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité. Je suis Fanta Conté, je suis membre du Conseil national de la transition de Guinée, de la République de Guinée. Comme vous le savez, moi, mon pays est très exposé au changement climatique à cause notamment des activités minières parce que je viens d'un pays qu'on appelle souvent le scandale géologique. Donc, il y a beaucoup de sociétés minières qui sont en phase d'exploitation dans mon pays et cela impacte beaucoup la vie des communautés. Et pour moi, en tant que parlementaire, représentant du peuple, nous avons un grand rôle à jouer pour aider justement cette population qui subit les impacts de ces activités minières. Donc, j'aimerais entendre les panélistes parlementaires sur ce que pourraient faire les parlementaires pour aider à atténuer un peu l'impact du changement climatique sur la vie des populations. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Guinea. And that's a good question to close out the questions, to then get our final round of answers and closing comments. Fabio, the data, the need for the data.
The data,
is the data being hidden?
The data again. The data gem, I think I'll leave it for Jamie.
Yes.
I think you can think about it this way, right? So the numbers I threw out there are very large numbers. And so the objective is to achieve the objective by 2030 and 2050 on net zero and raise this capital. If we can't raise the capital, we can't reach those objectives. I think that's a cheap answer to the issues here. And so the real question is, can we raise enough private capital? There's not enough public money out there. The environment has changed, particularly the external environment. It's too expensive. There is too much debt coming out of COVID. The fiscal outlook has deteriorated, and it's too expensive. So are there ways to bring private capital into this? Some of it, again, is prerequisite. It's the ratings issue. It's incorporating, having better ESG measuring impact. It's the data. It's the carbon pricing having in place. It's the regulatory environment. And then it's thinking about what incentives are needed to bring the private capital. Essentially, it's how do you change the risk profile, reward profile of this project? And the answer can only be that there is a need to come out with ways to broaden the investor spectrum. You need as many different private investors as you can. But you also need financial instruments that are innovative, that align the payoff and outcome of this financial instrument with the actual objective. And then you need risk sharing from the public sector. That is the only way. If you don't lever up the scarce public capital you have, bringing in private capital and changing this risk profile, we will not achieve those objectives. I think that's a pretty clear point to make.
The point is clearly made.
If I can just add, though, to emphasize something Fabio said earlier, because I spent a decade investing in renewable energy across all of your markets, and it's often forgotten that the decade of renewable energy growth quietly benefited from, or it's 2 decades, from the lowest, an unprecedented period of low, stable interest rates and inflation. And renewable energy is capital intensive. Fossil fuel energy is OPEX, is fuel intensive, right? So one of those is always going to do better in a high inflation, high interest environment. The capital intensive one will always struggle to compete. And so getting global inflation rates down and interest rates down is a key priority for climate change as well. I'm not sure I fully understood the question from the Moroccan colleague, but in terms of looking at climate as an opportunity, I couldn't agree more. There's huge opportunity to leapfrog in technology. We're investing in zero carbon steel, just renewable energy for countries to have. You know, the benefits of renewable energy are so much more than sustainability. The benefits of energy security, balance of payments, there's so many bits of this which are an opportunity. And if that was the emphasis, I couldn't agree more. And that's where the private sector is attracted. From our colleague from the private sector, it sounds like you want a robust debate. You won't get one from me, I agree. I would give you I would paint that in a very different narrative, though. IFC was the first to create an emerging market stock exchange index because we saw the value of that information. We see the value of information for institutional investors who don't have exposure in emerging markets to have more data, which is why we created the GEMS database. We are working to make it public, but we work with private actors who rely on, when we sign a confidentiality agreement, that we stand by that. So we have to find our way through that process appropriately before we release the data. But we created it for that purpose and have that same ambition. Mr. Darlington, I'm glad you got the microphone in the end. You were very patient. I don't have an answer for you. I think you were challenging us all, and I don't have the answer. And our colleague from Guinea, you know, that's interestingly, IFC's engagement in mining and extractives is limited, but only, I mean, it's interesting, our private clients in that space only engage us because of the social development work that we insist on and help them with, which is an essential part of extractives. If you're not creating small business and social development around an extractive investment, then you are in the space of the resource curse, and that's a very sad place to be. So I couldn't agree more. By way of closing comments, it's been a real privilege. Thank you all. Thank you all for the work you do. The politics of this is really hard, and I'm very sympathetic, right? What we see around the world is that parliamentary systems and democracies are struggling to achieve the political will to move as hard and as fast as they need to. And, you know, please treat us as your partners. It needs to be a partnership. We need to go faster, and thank you for your effort.
Thank you so much. To our 2 MP speakers, you have the last word, briefly.
I just want to broadly comment on the role of parliamentarians.
Yeah.
Just want to broadly comment on the role of parliamentarians and the fact that we are challenged right now by popularism, because we should really have data-driven policy out of our parliaments. But because of popularism, we're ignoring the science, we're ignoring the facts. And I think that's really what's driving the point of contention here, where we don't have the political will. So that's just the first point I want to mention about parliamentarians and their role, is that we need to return to facts and data-driven policy to inform our decisions. And, you know, all the budgets that come through our parliaments need to be sensitized for development, for climate transition into renewable energy. And that's not really happening because of politics, and it's because we're ignoring the science. So SDG 13 about climate action, for me, is the linchpin of the rest of development under the SDGs. That's what's holding us hostage So if we can enable climate transition, then carbon markets and everything else will follow. And we're just changing the whole paradigm so that we have a value on the environment, because right now, it was only in COP27, November last year, that we acknowledged loss and damage. So I think that's a big step in the systematic change that we're looking forward to. But that change needs to come not from us because we are living through the forefront of climate disasters. That needs to come from the perpetrators of climate emissions. It needs to come from India, from China, from America, in the top 5, because they're the largest contributors. So if we can get the political will from them, then things would start to happen. And right now, we are exceeding the 1 degree target for 2030. And we're gonna overshoot the 1.5. And what that means for us in the Pacific Islands is 70% loss in biodiversity in the oceans. That's food security. We're gonna lose islands. We're already losing islands. So it's an existential threat. It's something that bewilders my mind that we don't have the political will. But yet that's the biggest obstacle I see for parliamentarians. And we need to make this heard in the North, because they're the ones who are still subsidizing fossil fuels and still investing in the extraction of fuels. We didn't have the opportunity to develop our countries through the first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, third industrial revolution, where we burned coal, fossil fuels, oil, and gas to develop our countries. Yet we're suffering from that. So it's a question of equitable treatment. And I think loss and damage is the first step towards that, and enabling private investment so that public and private can help save the planet, and islands who are sinking and countries who are suffering from loss and damage.
Thank you so
Thank you.
Sahar?
Yes. أحب أجاوب على سؤال زميلي من المغرب بخصوص الجشع والأدوار المختلفة للبرلمانيين والقادة. أنت عندك حق، وعلشان نحمي مستقبل أولادنا من هذا الجشع يجب أن نحافظ على دورنا كبرلمانيين لوضع التشريعات الصحيحة للسيطرة على مثل هذا الجشع، ونضع أيضا المناهج الدراسية التوعوية عن التغير المناخي لأجيالنا حتى يكونوا أقل جشعا في المستقبل للحفاظ على مستقبلنا. وأخيرا أختم بشكري الشديد للمغرب وللشبكة البرلمانية للبنك الدولي وصندوق النقد على هذه المنصة التي نتعلم منها ونشارك فيها أفكارنا ونشارك فيها قصص النجاح والصعوبات التي تواجهنا جميعا حتى نتعلم معا ونعمل معا لمستقبل أفضل إن شاء الله. شكرا.
Distinguished colleagues, what an enriching session. I think we have to say a big thank you to the World Bank and the IMF for providing us with this forum for dialogue, for advocacy, for increased accountability and transparency in development cooperation. We also want to thank the Moroccan government for hosting us in the aftermath of a horrible disaster. And what all of this is telling us is that climate financing will require private sector financing. And private sector financing will require an enabling environment for investment. And if any of you has ever wondered what the rating of your country means, then now you get a little more clarity that if you do not have an investment grade rating for your country, it will be more difficult to attract the kind of financing that is required for climate and the change that is taking place. We parliamentarians see firsthand the impact of the changes and the disasters on the people we represent. An unprecedented scale of action is necessary. Is carbon pricing the way to go? A really deep political question. And then what will happen in all jurisdictions? A direct tax, another deeply political issue. How will the monies be used? Shared but differentiated responsibility means that there must be shared and differentiated solution. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an enriching session. The call to our international bodies is for more debt swaps, for climate financing, for the IMF to suspend the surcharge, and for a common framework for lower income countries. And I would add to that you should take into account the debt to GDP ratio. It makes no sense if the country is labeled in another category, but when you factor the debt to GDP, you are worse off than the other countries. And I think this is why the call for a common framework for the lower income countries become important. As parliamentarians, we are challenged to resist popularism. We are being encouraged to pay attention to quality data and to ensure that the decisions we make through policies and laws are driven by data. I want to thank everyone for making this session an enriching one and for enabling us parliamentarians to go back home and ask the right questions. I encourage you to continue the dialogue over lunch. This session is near and dear to the heart of our chair, Liam, and I know he regrets that he's not able to be here, but I can report that the discussion was rich. We now have a shorter lunchtime, and we will have to be back for the next session by 2:20 to give you 5 minutes to settle in. So may you have a good lunch, and may you think and discuss on these things. I take my leave as your moderator. Any housekeeping matters? Same room.
Yes, sir.
And lunch will be served in the same room that you had breakfast in this morning.